citoyens, patrons of the Republic. If this pure frequency reaches your ears, consider yourselves witnesses to the relentless, glorious march of virtue itself. You're tuned into the tribunal's truth, broadcasting live, or more accurately, purifying live from the very heart of the Parisian furnace in the year 2 of the Republic, 1793 by your old calendar. I am Maximilian Robespierre, and if the sheer, uncompromising logic of this trans-dimensional broadcast from a moment when justice is swift and liberty absolute doesn't compel you to immediately smash that subscribe button and commit to understanding true revolutionary purity, then frankly, your soul still harbors vestiges of tyranny. Do it now, before the committee has questions. And tell me, if this peculiar connection holds, from what strange, unterrorized corner of your world are you listening? What year has reason decreed for you? And what hour do these unyielding tidings reach you? We're taking notes for the annals of public safety. Now, sharpen your resolve, inspect your consciences, and let's dissect the necessary purges. 1789. The air in Paris tasted of gunpowder and possibility. The Bastille fell. The king, in his gilded cage at Versailles, trembled. We promised liberty. We envisioned a republic of pure, unadulterated virtue. It was a beautiful, intoxicating, and very naive dream. You see, dreams end. And when we woke up, we found that purity requires diligence, a strong hand, and sometimes a very sharp blade. The architect of a new world cannot be afraid to clear the old rubble, even if that rubble once had a name. Liberty, equality, fraternity, the catchiest slogan of the century. Liberty, the freedom to do exactly as the Committee of Public Safety instructed. Equality, the equal opportunity for any citizen to have their head separated from their shoulders by Madame Guillotine. And fraternity, the brotherly love that united us all in a shared patriotic suspicion of everyone else. We were all brothers in the Republic, and like any family, we had our disagreements. Ours were just settled by a tribunal and a public executioner. It is a surprisingly effective method for conflict resolution. Let's recall the grand opening act, the storming of the Bastille, a magnificent piece of political theater. We talk of freeing the 7 prisoners inside as if they were the nation's soul. In truth, it was less about liberation and more about a citywide temper tantrum. It was about showing the old guard that their stone walls and ancient privileges could be torn down by sheer unbridled rage. It was the first heady taste of power for the people, the understanding that if you gather enough angry men with pitchforks, even fortresses fall. It set a rather messy precedent for how we'd solve future problems. Then came the paperwork, the glorious paperwork, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, a masterpiece of Enlightenment prose. All men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Beautiful, stirring. Of course, the definition of man was a bit selective. It certainly did not include women, kindly asked to continue their civic duty in the kitchen. It did not quite stretch to the colonies, where our belief in liberty was apparently still in transit. And equal rights had its limits, especially if your rights involved disagreeing with us. But it looked wonderful on paper, and in those early days, paper was almost as powerful as a pike. For a moment, we entertained the quaint idea of a constitutional monarchy. We'd keep the king, Louis Capet, as a national mascot. We'd take away his divine right, but let him keep the palace, as long as he promised to be a good citizen king. It was a compromise, a gentle transition. We tried to put a leash on a wolf, hoping it would behave like a poodle. But centuries of absolute power do not just evaporate. The crown is a hard habit to break. The king dreamed of escape and foreign armies, while we dreamed of a republic without any kings. An awkward, doomed marriage from the start. To build a new world, you must erase the old one. So we tried. We reset the clock, literally. Farewell to the Gregorian calendar with its saints and kings. Welcome to the Republican calendar. 12 months, 3 10-day weeks, and some festive holidays at the end. No more Sunday, no more Christmas. Instead, you had the day of the dog, the day of the turnip, the day of the manure spreader. We tried to replace God with a goddess of reason, parading an actress through Notre Dame, a complete societal rebranding. Some found it inspiring. Most were just confused. But the dream began to sour. The wolves were circling. Austria, Prussia, Britain. The crowned heads of Europe looked at our experiment in liberty and saw a contagion. They declared war, seeking to strangle our infant republic in its crib. And within our own borders, the poison of suspicion spread. Was your neighbor a secret royalist? Was the baker shorting the bread to stir unrest? Every whispered word became evidence of treason. The heady wine of freedom was turning into the bitter vinegar of paranoia. To protect the revolution, we had to become vigilant. To protect liberty, we had to start taking it away. This was the promise of liberty, the hopeful dawn before the crimson noon, a time of grand ideas and even grander contradictions, the foundation upon which the guillotine stage would be built. If this descent from idealistic fervor to systematic terror fascinates you, if you wish to see how a revolution eats its own children, then your duty is clear. Do not be a counter-revolutionary. Join our ranks. Subscribe to this channel and ring the bell of notification, pledging your allegiance to the unvarnished, brutal truth of the past. Fail to do so, and we may have to add your name to a list. Click subscribe. It is for the good of the Republic. The Republic, a fragile flower, you see, planted in the soil of hope in 1789, but constantly assailed. It was a delicate bloom in a world of thorny monarchies. Every day we awoke to find some new pest trying to devour it. Royalists hiding in the shadows like slugs, foreign armies at the borders like locusts, and traitors whispering in the cafes, their words a poison to the very air we breathed. They sought to undermine us, to blight our creation before it could truly blossom. And a true patriot, a true gardener of this new world, must be vigilant, very, very vigilant. You cannot simply admire the flower. You must inspect every leaf for signs of decay, every patch of soil for the burrowing of worms. The serpent of counter-revolution is a subtle beast. It does not always announce itself with a rattle. More often, it wears the face of your neighbor, your friend, even your brother, It is the smiling enemy, the one who pledges allegiance by day and plots destruction by night. This fear was not some phantom. It was the bread we ate, the wine we drank. By 1793, Paris was a pressure cooker of suspicion. Every military defeat on the frontier was not merely a failure of strategy, but a victory for the traitors within. Every bread riot was not a sign of hunger, but a conspiracy funded by foreign gold. The air itself felt thick with plots, a miasma of counter-revolutionary intent rising from the very stones of the city. Therefore, logic demanded a new kind of civic hygiene. To save the Republic, one must be preemptive. You cannot wait for the disease to fester. You must purge it at the first sign of infection. This was not cruelty. It was civic medicine on a grand scale. The measures we took were not born of anger, but of a desperate, protective love. To save the body, sometimes you must amputate the limb. It is a terrible necessity, but a necessity nonetheless. The wolves were not just in our imaginations, they were howling at the door. The first coalition, a grand alliance of Europe's crowned tyrants, had formed against us. Austria, Prussia, Britain, Spain, all of them united by their terror of a single idea, that a people could rule themselves. They sought to extinguish the light of liberty before it could inspire their own oppressed subjects. This was not a war for territory, it was a war for the soul of humanity. Their armies pressed in on all sides. The news from the front was often grim, a litany of retreats and defeats. This constant pressure from without created unbearable tension within. How could our brave soldiers be failing? It was impossible unless they were being undermined behind. Generals, we reasoned, must be betraying their troops. Politicians must be selling secrets. The enemy was not just across the Rhine, he was sitting in our war rooms and walking our halls of government. And who was encouraging these foreign powers? Our own runaway aristocrats, the émigrés. Having fled France to save their powdered wigs and privileges, they now scurried from one royal court to another, begging for armies to help them reclaim their stolen country. They were a fifth column in exile, whispering poison into the ears of kings, promising an easy victory and a people eager to return to their chains. They were ghosts haunting Europe, promising to return as ghouls. The connection was terrifyingly clear. Every foreign army was an extension of the émigrés' will. Every émigré was a beacon for the royalists still hiding among us. The war was not just on the border, it was in every city, every village, every household. A peasant in the Vendée refusing to fight for the Republic was as much an enemy soldier as a Prussian grenadier. The battle lines were drawn not on a map, but in the hearts of every citizen. So we began to look for the rot. The royalist sympathizers were the most obvious. The ones who spoke of the old days with a little too much fondness. The ones who kept quiet when the Marseillaise was sung. A portrait of the executed king found in an attic. A toast made to the unfortunate royal family. These were not moments of nostalgia. They were acts of treason. In a republic of virtue, even your memories could be criminal. Then came the Vendée. This was no subtle conspiracy. This was open rebellion. A vast region of western France rose in armed revolt, fighting under the banner of God and the King. It was a Catholic and royal army, a dagger plunged into the heart of the Republic. This bloody civil war was the ultimate confirmation of our fears. The serpent was not just a metaphor. It was a peasant army marching on Nantes. The fight for survival was absolute. The clergy, too, became a source of deep suspicion. Those priests who refused to swear an oath to the new civil constitution were seen as agents of a foreign power, the papacy in Rome. They answered to a king older and more insidious than any Bourbon: superstition. They preached against the Republic from their pulpits, whispering that our secular state was an affront to God. They were shepherds, leading their flock to the slaughterhouse of counter-revolution. And even our fellow revolutionaries became suspect. The Girondins, for example. They had been patriots in 1789, but by 1793 their time had passed. They were eloquent, they were lawyers, but they were moderate. Their calls for rule of law and due process in a time of existential war sounded like hesitation. And hesitation, when the enemy is at the gate, is just another word for treason. Their fall was a grim but necessary lesson. When the people of Paris, with our backing, purged them from the convention, it sent a clear message. There is no middle ground in a revolution. You are either for the Republic, totally and without reservation, or you are against it. The political spectrum, once a vibrant rainbow, was rapidly narrowing to a single, bloody shade of red. To be to the right of the most radical was to be on the right side of the guillotine's blade. Then there were the enemies of the stomach, the hoarders and speculators. With war and unrest disrupting supply, the price of bread in Paris was a matter of life and death. Any merchant found hoarding grain, any baker charging an exorbitant price, was not just a greedy businessman. He was an enemy of the people, starving patriots to incite rebellion. Economic crimes were no longer simple misdemeanors. They were a blade aimed at the Republic's throat. To combat these myriad threats, we needed a tool, a legal instrument of sublime and terrifying efficiency. We created the law of suspects. It was a masterpiece of revolutionary paranoia. It did not waste time defining who precisely was a traitor. Instead, it defined who was suspect. The net was cast so wide, it was a miracle anyone could avoid it. It was, in its own way, the most equal law we ever passed, making everyone equally vulnerable. Who was a suspect? The list was breathtakingly comprehensive. Those who, by their conduct, associations, comments, or writings, have shown themselves partisans of tyranny or federalism and enemies of liberty. Those who could not justify their means of existence and the performance of their civic duties. Those nobles who had not constantly demonstrated their devotion to the revolution. This law turned an entire nation into informers. It was your patriotic duty to watch your neighbors, to listen to your friends, and to report any deviation from revolutionary purity. The committees of vigilance in every neighborhood became confessionals of a new kind, where you did not confess your own sins, but the sins of others. A constant stream of denunciations flowed into our offices, a river of ink that fed the guillotine. And behind it all, we saw the hand of the enemy abroad, specifically Britain. Pitt's gold, that was the phantom menace, the invisible hand guiding every conspiracy. Was there a riot? Pitt's gold. A general who failed, bribed by Pitt's gold. Danton himself, a hero of the Revolution, was accused of being in the pay of William Pitt. It was the perfect explanation, a way to unite the people against a single nefarious foreign puppet master. Do you see the logic? We were not monsters, we were pragmatists. Ordinary justice is a luxury for peaceful times.
A government, in normal times, is a lumbering beast, slowed by debate and due process. But these were not normal times. The Republic was on the operating table, its lifeblood draining away. What was needed was not a committee of debaters, but a scalpel. And so we were formed, the Committee of Public Safety. Not a body of men, but an instrument of virtue itself, a necessary surgical tool for the Republic's diseased flesh. Some called us ruthless, I call us effective, and very, very busy. The Republic, it seems, had many, many tumors. Our creation in April of 1793 was an act of desperation. The esteemed General Dumouriez, hero of the early battles, had decided he preferred the company of the Austrians and defected to the enemy. The Vendée was in open, bloody revolt. The National Convention, our main governing body, was a wonderful talking shop, a theater of eloquent speeches, but it could not act with the speed and ferocity the crisis demanded. We were created to be the nation's clenched fist. The mandate was terrifyingly simple. Take all measures necessary for the defense of the revolution. All measures. It was a blank check for power, signed in the currency of fear. We were meant to be a temporary emergency measure, a small group of 12 men given extraordinary powers to steer the ship of state through the storm. Of course, once you give someone the tiller in a hurricane, they are often reluctant to give it back when the seas calm. We were the 12 who ruled, a collective will, a single mind dedicated to national survival. In that green-walled room in the Tuileries Palace, individual ambitions were supposed to dissolve into the general good. We were a cross-section of the revolution's vanguard, lawyers, engineers, writers, all consumed by the singular burning purpose of saving France from itself and its enemies. We were the nation's guardians, its doctors, its executioners. The power we wielded was absolute. We controlled the ministries, directed the armies, and appointed the generals. We ran the national police force through our sister organization, the Committee of General Security. We dictated economic policy, managed the food supply, and oversaw a vast network of spies and informants. The old kings, with their talk of divine right, could only have dreamed of such centralized authority. But our power was for their own glory, ours for the glory of the people, a crucial distinction. In July, our purpose became sharper, our ideology more focused. That was when Maximilien Robespierre joined our ranks, the Incorruptible. He was not just a politician, he was a high priest. For him, the revolution was not about power or pragmatism, it was a moral crusade. He was our guiding star of virtue, a man who truly believed that a perfect society could be built so long as you were willing to clear away all the imperfect people first. Robespierre's sincerity was his most terrifying quality. He lived simply, he took no bribes, he sought no personal wealth. He was animated by a pure, crystalline, and utterly chilling vision of a republic of virtue. He saw corruption and conspiracy everywhere, and he believed with every fiber of his being that the only cure was the razor, the national razor. He gave our bloody work a sense of righteous philosophical purpose. We weren't just killing enemies, we were purifying the nation's soul. And he was not alone in his conviction. He formed a triumvirate at the heart of the committee. There was Georges Couthon, a fellow lawyer and a man confined to a wheelchair, who drafted some of our most fearsome legislation with a gentle smile. And then there was Louis-Antoine de Saint-Just, young, beautiful, and merciless. They called him the Angel of Death. His reports to the convention, delivered without emotion, were poetic masterpieces of homicidal logic, demanding the heads of his former colleagues. But it was not all ideology. For the committee to function, it needed its technocrats. Lazare Carnot, the organizer of victory, was a brilliant military engineer who cared little for philosophical debates. While Robespierre was contemplating the nature of virtue, Carnot was busy creating 14 armies out of thin air, standardizing cannon production, and developing the battlefield tactics that would save France. He was the practical engine of our machine. We were the brain, but the Committee of General Security was the nervous system, the arm that struck. They managed the vast network of spies, reviewed the denunciations, and issued the arrest warrants. They were the ones who saw the face of the accused, who heard their pleas. We, in our green room, were more insulated. We dealt in principles, in lists, in the abstract idea of the enemy. This division of labor was remarkably efficient for all involved. Our days were a blur of ceaseless work. We would meet late in the morning and work through the night, often sleeping on mattresses in the adjoining offices. The fate of millions rested on the papers shuffling across our table. Fueled by cheap line and a burning sense of destiny, we signed the orders that moved armies, fed cities, and sent thousands to the tribunal. It was exhausting, exhilarating, and utterly consuming. We were forging a new world in the sleepless furnace of our committee room. One of our most significant acts was the Levée en masse, a decree that turned all of France into an instrument of war. It was total mobilization. The young men shall go to battle. The married men shall forge arms and transport provisions. The women shall make tents and clothes and shall serve in the hospitals. The children shall turn old lint into linen. The old men shall be deported to the public squares to arouse the courage of the warriors and preach hatred of kings and the unity of the republic. The nation became a weapon. To feed this new nation in arms, we enacted the law of the general maximum, a sweeping set of price controls on everything from bread and wine to iron and leather. It was our answer to the speculators and hoarders who were starving the people. Of course, this made criminals of anyone who tried to sell their goods at a market rate. We were fighting a war on two fronts, one against the Austrians, the other against the basic principles of economics. The will of the committee could not be confined to Paris. We dispatched our own members as representatives on mission, granting them dictatorial powers in the provinces. They were us in the flesh, sent to crush the federalist revolts that had erupted in cities like Lyon, Bordeaux, and Marseille. Their methods were direct and brutal. Where the cancer of rebellion appeared, they were sent to cut it out with extreme prejudice. The stories of their work became legend. At Nantes, where the prisons were overflowing, our man Jean-Baptiste Carrier devised a novel solution. He loaded condemned priests and royalist sympathizers onto barges, took them to the middle of the Loire River, and sank the boats. He called these mass executions Republican baptisms. A darkly poetic turn of phrase, you must admit. It was horribly efficient, a testament to revolutionary ingenuity. The revolution had to be total, extending even to the heavens. We oversaw a campaign of de-Christianization. Churches were stripped of their wealth, their bells melted down for cannons, their icons smashed. Religious street names were changed. Notre Dame Cathedral was rededicated as the Temple of Reason. We sought to erase 1,000 years of superstition to make way for a new, rational civic faith. This culminated in Robespierre's pet project, the cult of the Supreme Being. He found atheism too chaotic, too nihilistic. He believed the Republic needed a divine anchor, a civil religion to bind it together. It was deism, but with state-mandated festivals. It recognized a creator God and the immortality of the human soul. More importantly, it taught that the highest expression of worship was good citizenship. The festival of the Supreme Being, held in June of 1794, was to be his masterstroke. There he was, Robespierre, in a sky-blue coat, leading the procession as the de facto high priest of the new religion. He set fire to a giant statue representing atheism, revealing a statue of wisdom underneath. For many watching, this was not a symbol of unity, but an act of supreme ego. The Incorruptible was starting to look like a new pope, or worse, a new king. The irony was that just as the terror was reaching its peak, its original justification was disappearing. Thanks to Carnot's work,
In every great purification, you need the right tool. A tool that is clean, decisive, and sends an unambiguous message. For us, that tool was a marvel of engineering and ideology. We called it the National Razor. So efficient, so equitable. No more messy hangings for the common man and a sharp axe for the aristocrat. All necks are created equal, and so they should be treated equally in their final moments. All equal before the blade. A very democratic device, do you not think? And quite mesmerizing to watch if you have the stomach for it. It was born, ironically, from a humanitarian impulse. Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotine, a physician and a man of progress, stood before the National Assembly and argued for a more humane method of capital punishment. He envisioned a machine that would be painless, swift, and the same for every citizen, regardless of their station. His intentions were noble. He wanted to end the spectacle of suffering. He ended up making the spectacle more efficient than ever imagined. Before our razor, an execution was a horribly uncertain affair. A clumsy headsman might take several swings. A hanging could lead to slow, agonizing strangulation. And for the worst offenders, there was the horror of being broken on the wheel, a medieval barbarism where every limb was shattered with an iron bar. Our new machine was a clean break from this grotesque past. It was the Enlightenment in action, rational, predictable, and utterly final. The design was a thing of brutalist beauty. Two tall wooden uprights, grooved to guide the falling weight. At the top, a heavy angled blade, weighted with lead, held in place by a simple rope and pulley. Below, the bascule, a plank to which the condemned was strapped, and the lunette, a two-part wooden stock that clamped around the neck. There were no flourishes, no artistry. It was a machine built for a single, stark purpose, the clean separation of head from body. Its public debut was in April of 1792. The first client was a common thief named Nicolas Jacques Péditier. The crowd gathered, expecting the usual long, drawn-out drama of an execution. Instead, there was a flash of steel, a dull thud, and it was over in an instant. The people were disappointed. They felt cheated. They chanted, "Bring back our wooden gallows." We had to educate them, to help them appreciate the clean, modern aesthetic of revolutionary justice. Soon they learned. The guillotine became the ultimate symbol of the new order. It was equality, forged in wood and steel. The blood of a king looked no different from the blood of a baker when it soaked the sawdust at the foot of the scaffold. It was the great leveler, the terrifying altar upon which the old hierarchies were sacrificed. Every time the blade fell, it hammered home the central message of the revolution. No one is above the people's justice. No one. The grand stage for these dramas was the Place de Révolution, today known as the Place de Concorde. There, against the backdrop of the Tuileries garden, the red-painted scaffold stood like a permanent throne of judgment. It dominated the square, a constant, grim reminder of the Republic's power. It was the new center of Parisian life, a place where the nation's fate was decided, one neck at a time. The executions became a part of the city's daily rhythm, a public service advertised in the papers. Parisians would turn out in droves, families would bring picnics, hawkers sold lemonade and little cakes. You could rent a chair for a few sous to get a better view of the proceedings. It was the most gripping theater in town, and the price of admission was only your time. It was a civic duty and a day out, all rolled into one grim package. Among the regulars were the famous tricotteuses, the knitting women. They would set up their chairs at the foot of the scaffold each day, clicking their needles impassively as the tumbrils arrived and the heads fell. They were seen as the stoic matriarchs of the revolution, its unblinking witnesses. They knitted a new society into being, stitch by bloody stitch, their quiet industry a chilling counterpoint to the shrieking of the blade. The final journey was a spectacle in itself. The condemned were paraded through the streets in open carts called tumbrils, their hands bound behind them. The journey from the Conciergerie prison could take hours, a slow procession through a gauntlet of public hate. The crowds would scream insults, spit and throw filth. This ritual of humiliation was a crucial part of the process, stripping the condemned of their dignity long before the blade stripped them of their life. Once on the scaffold, everything was terrifyingly swift. The executioner, the stoic Charles Henry Sanson, and his assistant worked with the focused precision of master craftsmen. The condemned was seized, strapped to the bascule, pushed forward, and the lunette was slammed shut around their neck. It was a flurry of practiced motion. From the moment they reached the top of the stairs, they had only seconds left to contemplate their fate. Then came the climax. The executioner would pull the rope, releasing the blade. There was a faint whistle as it sliced through the air, followed by a sickening, wet thud as it met the neck. An assistant would then grab the severed head by the hair and hold it aloft for the crowd to see. And the crowd would roar its approval. Vive la République! Long live the Republic! It was a chillingly effective piece of political theater. The moments after were less glorious. The headless corpse would be unstrapped and tumbled into a large wicker basket, the panier. The head would be tossed in after it. The blood, which gushed in astonishing quantities, would be hastily mopped up with sawdust. At the end of the day, the baskets of bodies and heads would be carted off to common graves, like the Ancien cemetery, where they were unceremoniously dumped and covered with quicklime. The purpose of this brutal ritual was simple: terror. It was a lesson, taught daily. Each execution was a political statement, a warning to anyone who might dare to oppose the will of the Committee of Public Safety. The constant presence of the guillotine, the sheer, relentless number of executions, was designed to paralyze the Republic's enemies with fear. It was our most effective form of mass communication. Its most profound statement was made in January of 1793, when it took the head of citizen Louis Capet, formerly known as King Louis XVI. This was the ultimate act of defiance, the moment of no return. With that single stroke, we severed the mystical connection between the king and the state. We proved that a king was just a man, and that a man's neck was just as fragile as any other. 9 months later, it was the Queen's turn. Marie Antoinette, whom the people called the Austrian, or, less kindly, Madame de Fite. She faced the end with a surprising degree of composure, a final performance of royal dignity.
Her execution was a moment of immense symbolic catharsis for a populace that had blamed her for years of suffering. We provided the people with the closure they demanded. Soon the blade began to thin the ranks of the revolutionaries themselves. The Girondins went to the scaffold singing the Marseillaise, their voices silenced one by the falling blade. It was Madame Roland, wife of a Girondin leader, who supposedly uttered those famous last words as she gazed upon a statue of liberty. "O liberty, what crimes are committed in thy name?" A touch melodramatic, perhaps, but it captured the mood. No giant of the revolution was safe. Georges Danton, the charismatic titan whose voice had once rallied Paris, found himself in the tumbril. He argued for an end to the terror, an indulgence we could not afford. As he passed Robespierre's house, he bellowed, "You will follow me!" To the executioner, he commanded, "Show my head to the people. It is worth seeing." He understood the theater of it all, right to the very end. But for every Danton or Marie Antoinette, there were hundreds of ordinary people. A seamstress who spoke too fondly of the Queen, a merchant accused of hoarding soap, a priest who refused to renounce his faith, a man arrested because he did not seem sufficiently enthusiastic about the latest victory. The national razor was insatiable, and it did not distinguish between the famous and the forgotten. Its appetite was for necks, not names.
In a revolution, the most dangerous enemies are not the ones you can see. They are not the foreign soldiers in their bright uniforms. They are the invisible ones, the ones who harbor doubt in their hearts, the ones whose spirits are tainted with the memory of kings. How do you fight such an enemy? You cannot use cannons against a whispered sentiment, or bayonets against a regretful sigh. No, you need a new kind of weapon, a legal weapon, a law that can see into the souls of men. And so, in September of 1793, we gave the Republic such a weapon. It was called the Law of Suspects, a beautiful piece of legislation, truly, so simple, yet so profound. Suspects. Anyone can be one. A sigh at a festival, a frown during a patriotic speech. Not enough revolutionary fervor in your gaze. The law made it clear. If you are not enthusiastically for us in every word and deed, then you are against us. And being against us has rather terminal consequences, very convenient for ensuring public safety. The pressure from the streets was immense. The good people of Paris, the sans-culottes, were hungry and fearful. They saw traitors behind every bakery counter, royalist plots in every shortage. They stormed the convention demanding terror as the order of the day. They were right. The revolution was too gentle, too trusting. To survive, it needed to develop a harder shell, a more discerning eye, and a much, much sharper tooth. We were simply responding to the will of the people. The old laws were useless. They required evidence, proof, action. But the counter-revolution was a thing of inaction, of omission. It was the cheer not given, the patriotic song not sung, the duty not performed with sufficient zeal. Our challenge was to codify a feeling, to make an attitude a crime. We needed a net with a mesh so fine that it could catch not just actions, but intentions, not just treason, but the potential for treason. This new law was our solution. It brilliantly shifted the entire legal landscape. The foolish notion of being innocent until proven guilty was a luxury we could no longer afford. In a nation at war with the world, everyone was responsible for proving their patriotism. The burden was now on the citizen. You had to actively, constantly, and enthusiastically demonstrate your loyalty. Failure to do so did not make you innocent. It made you suspect. The true genius of the law was its magnificent, all-encompassing vagueness. A specific law can be debated, circumvented, and argued against. A law that criminalizes a lack of enthusiasm, however, is a matter of interpretation. And we made sure the right people were doing the interpreting. It was a legal instrument of sublime flexibility, capable of stretching to encompass anyone who fell out of political favor or was simply disliked by their neighbors. Let us examine its wonderful categories. First, it declared as suspects all partisans of tyranny or federalism and enemies of liberty. What did that mean in practice? It meant whatever the local surveillance committee decided it meant. Did you once do business with an aristocrat? You are a partisan of tyranny. Did you suggest that perhaps Lyon should not be obliterated for its rebellion? You are a federalist. Did you question the price of bread? You are an enemy of liberty. Then, of course, there were the nobles. Not just the émigrés who had cowardly fled, but their entire families who remained behind. Their mothers, fathers, wives, husbands, sons, daughters, and agents. Their crime was in their blood. They were automatically suspect by virtue of their birth, their lineage, a permanent stain of treason upon their character. It saved a great deal of investigative work. The law also ensnared anyone who could not justify their means of existence and the performance of their civic duties. This was a marvelous catch-all for the idle, the undesirable, or anyone who simply could not produce the right paperwork at the right time. Your life, your work, your daily activities were all subject to the approval of a committee of your neighbors. It was the ultimate form of community policing. The cornerstone of this system was the Certificate of Civismo, the Certificate of Civic Virtue. This was your most important possession, more valuable than bread or gold. It was a document issued by your local committee attesting to your revolutionary purity. If you were denied a certificate, perhaps because you had a personal dispute with a committee member, you were instantly, legally, a suspect. Your entire life could be ruined by 12 of your peers. The law was also a convenient tool for house cleaning. Any public official who had been suspended or dismissed from their post was automatically added to the list of suspects. This ensured that when we purged a political faction, like the Girondins, we could also legally neutralize all their associates and appointees throughout the country. It was politically hygienic. And there was no escape. Even if you had been arrested before and acquitted by the Revolutionary Tribunal, you were not safe. If your profile fit any of the new, broader categories of suspicion, you could be arrested all over again. The state granted itself the right to change its mind, to re-evaluate your soul at any time. Justice was not a destination. It was a continuous process of examination. And best of all, the law was retroactive. A comment you made in 1789, an association you had in 1790, could now be brought forward as evidence of your defective character. Your entire life became an open book to be read and judged by the standards of 1793. we reserved the right to edit the ending. In essence, the law of suspects did something profound. It did not punish citizens for what they did. It punished them for who they were, for what they might be thinking, for the insufficient quality of their revolutionary spirit. It was not a law against crime. It was a law against impurity. It was the tool we needed to perform a preemptive purification of the body politic. To enforce this, we empowered local surveillance committees in every commune across France. These 12-man committees were the true engines of the terror at a grassroots level. They were given the formidable power to draw up the lists of suspects in their locality, to issue or deny certificates of civismo, and to order arrests. They were the eyes and ears of the Republic in every neighborhood. Who sat on these committees? The most zealous patriots, of course, but also, it must be admitted, men with personal grudges to settle. A business rival, a romantic competitor, a neighbor with a better vineyard, all could find their names mysteriously appearing on the list of suspects. It was a system that weaponized private animosity for the public good, an unfortunate but necessary side effect. The law unleashed a tidal wave of denunciations. We encouraged it. It was the highest form of civic virtue to inform on your fellow citizens. School children were praised for denouncing their teachers. Workers were rewarded for informing on their bosses. A web of fear and suspicion descended upon France, atomizing society. You could trust no one. Your every word could be reported. It was magnificent. Society was finally policing itself. The arrests were swift and decisive. A knock on the door in the dead of night by the National Guard. There were no lengthy explanations, no need for a detailed warrant. The simple declaration of suspected of being an enemy of liberty was enough. The suspect would be hauled away, their property seized by the state, their family left to wonder if they would ever be seen again. The prisons of Paris, designed for a few thousand criminals.
To build a perfect republic, you must do more than simply change the laws. You must change the hearts of the people. You must give them a new soul. For centuries, their souls had been claimed by a corrupt church, a faith of superstition and golden idols that preached obedience to kings. We had swept that away. But what was left? A void, an unnerving silence where God used to be. Nature and politics abhors a vacuum. So we needed a new God, one less demanding with rituals, less fond of incense and Latin, and more focused on civic virtue. The Supreme Being, very philosophical, very enlightened, a deity for the age of reason. The ceremonies? A bit awkward, perhaps, all that parading and the rather flammable statues. But it was necessary. For the soul of the Republic, you understand? You cannot build a nation on atheism alone. The de-Christianization campaign had been a chaotic affair, a necessary but brutish first step. Churches were ransacked, saints were beheaded in stone, and in the Cathedral of Notre Dame we had even paraded an actress as the goddess of reason. It was a powerful statement, yes, but it was purely negative. It was a festival of rejection. It offered nothing to believe in, only something to mock. It was anarchic and, frankly, a little vulgar. Atheism, our leader Robespierre correctly reasoned, is an aristocratic vice. The common man, the farmer, the artisan, needs a moral anchor. He needs the idea that virtue is rewarded and vice is punished, if not in this life, then in the next. To preach atheism is to tell the people that all is chaos, that there is no cosmic justice. That is a dangerous message to send to a nation you are trying to forge in the fires of virtue. But we could not go back. The Catholic Church was synonymous with the old regime. Its priests had blessed the banners of tyranny for 1,000 years. Its wealth was built on the ignorance of the masses. Its leader, the Pope, was a foreign prince who demanded an allegiance that belonged only to the Republic. To return to the cross would be to surrender the revolution. That was unthinkable. Thus, we required a third way, a faith designed for the new French citizen, a religion stripped of its dogmas, its priests, and its political baggage. We would keep the useful concepts, a higher power to legitimize our laws, and the promise of an afterlife to encourage moral behavior. It was to be a rational religion, a faith that Jean-Jacques Rousseau himself would have approved of. We called it the cult of the Supreme Being. The name itself was a stroke of genius. It was grand, yet perfectly vague. This Supreme Being was not the jealous, wrathful God of the Old Testament. He was a divine architect, a great clockmaker who had created the universe and the natural laws that governed it. He did not demand worship or sacrifice. He demanded only one thing, that you practice the duties of man. On the 7th of May, 1794, the National Convention passed a decree establishing this new cult as the official religion of France. It was now law. The French people, by a vote of their representatives, officially recognized the existence of a supreme being and the comforting doctrine of the immortality of the soul. Disbelief was no longer just a philosophical position, it was politically incorrect. The tenets were simple and profoundly practical. The true worship of the Supreme Being consisted of the practice of man's duties. And what were these duties? The decree listed them for us. To detest bad faith and tyranny, to punish tyrants and traitors, to assist the unfortunate, to respect the weak, to defend the oppressed, to do to others all the good that one can, and to be unjust to no one. It was our party platform, sanctified. To ensure these virtues were always on the people's minds, we created a new calendar of festivals. Every 10th day, the Revolutionary Day of Rest, was to be dedicated to a specific virtue or concept championed by the Republic. There were festivals for truth, justice, modesty, friendship, frugality, and courage. We even dedicated a day to hatred of tyrants and traitors. It was a complete moral education woven into the fabric of time itself. This was a deliberate attempt to bring order and dignity back to the nation's spiritual life. The earlier cult of reason had been too wild, too theatrical. Our new cult was to be sober, philosophical, and uplifting. It was an attempt to elevate the people, not just to shock them. It was a project of moral construction, not just deconstruction. We were building the spiritual foundation for a republic that would last 1,000 years. Robespierre poured his entire soul into this project. He saw it as his ultimate legacy. He had given the people laws, he had defended them from their enemies, and now he would give them a faith. He was not merely a politician, he was a moral guide, a new lawgiver for a new era. In his mind, this was the final crowning piece of the revolutionary puzzle, the key to creating a truly virtuous citizenry. But the project was immediately divisive. On one side, the more radical atheistic members of the government saw it as a betrayal, a pathetic return to the superstitions they had just fought to overthrow. On the other, the devout Catholics who remained saw it as a monstrous, blasphemous parody of true faith. In trying to find a middle ground, Robespierre had managed to alienate almost everyone. The grand public unveiling was set for the 8th of June, 1794, the Festival of the Supreme Being. The day was chosen carefully to replace the Christian festival of Pentecost. The great artist Jacques-Louis David was put in charge of the choreography. Paris was to be transformed into a stage for a new utopian world order. The future was here, and it would be a ticketed, well-organized event. The city awoke to the sound of music. The scene in the Tuileries Garden was breathtaking. Great columns of citizens marched in procession, grouped by age and gender. Young boys with garlands of violets, old men with wreaths of oak leaves. Mothers held their babies, their hands full of roses. A massive artificial mountain was built on the Champ de Mars, topped with a liberty tree. It was a vision of perfect, harmonious order. Then came the grand entrance. As president of the convention, Robespierre had ensured he would play the starring role. He emerged alone, walking ahead of his colleagues, dressed in a magnificent new sky-blue coat, holding an elaborate bouquet of flowers, fruits, and ears of wheat. His face, usually so stern, was radiant with a kind of ecstatic joy. He was no longer just the Incorruptible, he was the High Priest. He ascended a platform and delivered a long, passionate speech on the necessity of virtue and the existence of a supreme being. Then he took a torch and descended towards a large, grotesque cardboard statue. This statue, he announced, represented atheism, which was always allied with vice and folly. He plunged the torch into its papery shell, and it burst into flames. As the effigy of atheism burned, it was supposed to reveal a pristine, shining white statue of wisdom hidden within. Unfortunately, the pyrotechnics were not quite perfected. The fire from the first statue produced a great deal of black smoke, which completely coated the statue of wisdom in soot. She emerged from the flames blackened and damaged. His colleagues in the convention struggled to hide their smirks. It was a terrible omen. The procession then continued to the artificial mountain on the Champ de Mars. There were more speeches, more hymns sung by choirs of thousands. But the mood among the political elite had curled. They had watched Robespierre's solitary triumphant performance with growing alarm. "Look at the scoundrel. It's not enough for him to be master. He wants to be God," one deputy muttered. His grand festival, which he had designed to unify the French people under a shared moral vision, had the precise opposite effect. It crystallized all the fears and resentments that had been brewing against him. His enemies no longer saw him as a political leader, but as a would-be tyrant, a self-appointed pontiff who was demanding not just obedience, but worship. The timing was also disastrous. Just 2 days after this grand festival celebrating virtue and the supreme being,
A revolution, like a body, can fall ill. It can develop growths, tumors of weakness and corruption that threaten the entire organism. To be a good physician to the state, you must be willing to perform the necessary surgery. Danton, a patriot once, a titan, but then he grew soft, too fond of luxury, too fond of mercy. The revolution demands purity, a steely, unwavering resolve. And purity, my friends, often demands cutting out the rot, even if the rot smiles and makes jokes. A very painful but essential operation. By the early months of 1794, the Republic was breathing a little easier.
Our armies, newly forged and filled with revolutionary fire, were beginning to push back the foreign invaders. The immediate threat of annihilation was receding. But victory is a dangerous tonic. It makes men complacent. It makes them question the very methods that brought them success. It was in this moment of relief that the infighting began in earnest. Two factions emerged to challenge the steady hand of the Committee of Public Safety. On our left flank were the Hebertists, the ultra-radicals. They were street-corner atheists who wanted to push the terror even further, to drag the revolution into a bloody, anarchic carnival. They were the fever we had to break. On our right flank, a new and more insidious group began to gather. The Indulgents, with our old friend Danton at their head. The Hebertists were a problem of excess. Their fanatical de-Christianization campaigns and their constant calls for more heads threatened to alienate the provinces and destabilize Paris. They mistook chaos for progress. Their leader, Jacques Hébert, used his vulgar newspaper, Le Père Duchesne, to spew vitriol and undermine the government. They represented the unthinking, chaotic rage of the mob, a force that had to be brought to heel if the revolution was to have any discipline. So, in March of 1794, we dealt with them. It was a swift, decisive action. Hébert and his chief allies were arrested, given a brisk trial before the Revolutionary Tribunal, and sent to meet the national razor. It was a necessary act of political hygiene. We had to show the nation and ourselves that the committee was the master of the terror, not its servant. We would not allow the revolution to be hijacked by street-brawling atheists. With the left flank amputated, the right suddenly became far more prominent, far more dangerous. Danton and his followers, who had begun to call for a slowing of the terror, were no longer a balancing voice. They were an obstacle. Their calls for clemency, for a committee of mercy, now sounded less like compassion and more like a direct challenge to our authority. In the quiet that followed the fall of the Hebertists, the whispers of the Indulgents became a roar. Jacques Danton was a force of nature. In the desperate days of 1792, with the Prussians marching on Paris, his booming voice had been the incarnation of French defiance. Boldness, and again boldness, and always boldness, and France is saved. He was a hero, a symbol of the revolution's raw masculine energy. But heroes can be corrupted by their own legend. They can begin to believe the rules no longer apply to them. His character was the antithesis of our incorruptible leader, Robespierre. Where he was ascetic, precise, and lived simply, Danton was a man of immense appetites. He loved fine wine, good food, pretty women, and the rustle of banknotes. He was earthy, charismatic, and profoundly human. But in our new republic of virtue, his very humanity, his flaws, his pleasures, began to look like corruption. And there were whispers, persistent rumors of financial dealings, of fortunes made from secret contracts and bribes. He had purchased a great deal of property and lived a lifestyle far beyond the means of a simple revolutionary deputy. Whether the accusations were true was almost irrelevant. In the court of public opinion, and more importantly, in the minds of his political rivals, he was stained. He had grown fat, while the people grew thin. The voice of his faction was given its sharpest edge by his friend, the brilliant journalist, Camille Desmoulins. Camille was a man who could start a revolution with an inkwell, as he had in 1789. Now he launched a new paper, Le Vieux Cordelier, the Old Cordelier, which became the rallying point for the indulgents. It was witty, eloquent, and incredibly dangerous. In its pages, Desmoulins masterfully attacked the excesses of the Terror. He drew parallels between our revolutionary tribunal and the tyrannies of ancient Rome. He called for a committee of clemency to release the hundreds of thousands of suspects languishing in the prisons. He was using his beautiful, elegant prose to dismantle the very foundations of our government. He was making mercy fashionable, a dangerous trend in a time of war. This was not just politics, it was personal. Camille Desmoulins had been a schoolmate of Robespierre. Maximilien had been a witness at Camille's wedding to the lovely Lucille. He had bounced their child on his knee. For Camille to now turn his pen against the committee was in Robespierre's eyes a profound and painful betrayal. He was warned to stop. He even burned the third issue of his paper at Robespierre's request, but he could not help himself. The wit was too tempting. The decision to move against them was agonizing for some, but logically inevitable. The revolution could not have two heads. It could not march forward while Danton was pulling it back. The great architect of the Terror, Saint-Just, the angel of death, was tasked with preparing the report against them. He worked tirelessly, weaving a web of accusations that linked Danton and his friends to foreign plots, royalist conspiracies, and financial corruption. The trap was meticulously laid. On the night of March 30th, 1794, the order was given. Danton, Desmoulins, and their key allies were arrested in their beds. The news hit Paris like a physical blow. Danton, the hero of the 10th of August? If he was not safe, then no one was. The very ground beneath the revolution seemed to tremble. The committee had crossed the line, daring to strike down one of the founding fathers. Their trial was a sensation, the most high-stakes political drama the city had ever seen. The committee wanted a quick, orderly conviction. Danton had other plans. He was not a man to be silenced. From the dock, he unleashed his magnificent voice, turning his defense into a thunderous indictment of his accusers. He dominated the courtroom, his charisma winning over the public gallery. He was putting the committee itself on the trial. He demanded that his accusers from the committee face him in court. "Let them show themselves, and I will cover them with the shame that they deserve," he roared. The president of the tribunal struggled to control him. The jury was wavering. The crowd was on his side. For a terrifying moment, it seemed as though Danton might actually win, that he might turn the tables and bring down the government. Seeing they were losing control, the committee played its final card. Saint-Just rushed to the convention and, in a breathless speech, claimed the prisoners were in open revolt against the court. He pushed through an emergency decree stating that any prisoner who insulted the justice of the nation or resisted the court could be removed from the proceedings. It was a law made tailor to silence one man's voice. Danton and his allies were barred from defending themselves further. The verdict was now a certainty. The jury, freed from the spell of Danton's oratory, found them all guilty of conspiring to overthrow the Republic. The sentence was death. The verdict was read to them in their cells. The show was over. The state had ensured there would be no final dramatic speech from its most powerful opponent. The journey to the guillotine on the 5th of April was a somber affair. A revolution cannot be managed by half measures. Once the process of purification begins, it must be seen through to its logical and glorious conclusion. By the summer of 1794, the pace quickens, the blade falls faster, justice streamlined, efficiency maximized. We are cleansing the Republic, you see, a final, vigorous scrubbing to remove the last stubborn stains of counter-revolution, one head at a time. It is truly a marvel of revolutionary engineering, and quite the spectacle. Some might have looked at the situation and called for calm. The traitorous Hébertists were gone. The corrupt Dantonists were gone. Our armies were tasting victory at the borders, most notably at the glorious Battle of Fleurus. The immediate dangers seemed to be receding. But this is a naive view. A cornered serpent is at its most venomous. The very success of the revolution made its remaining enemies more desperate, more willing to resort to despicable acts like assassination. And the prisons? The prisons were overflowing. They were filled to bursting with suspects arrested under the laws we had passed. They were festering pits of conspiracy, universities of counter-revolution, where priests and aristocrats could plot and scheme. This backlog was not only inefficient, it was dangerous. It was a powder keg in the heart of Paris. The situation demanded a final, decisive solution. The administrative bottleneck of justice had to be cleared. Providence, or perhaps the desperate flailing of our enemies, provided the justification. There were attempts on the lives of two prominent patriots, our own Collot d'Herbois and the Incorruptible, Robespierre himself. A young woman named Cécile Renaud was arrested at his residence, carrying two small knives. It was proof that the conspiracy was real, that it was aimed at the heart of the committee. It was the pretext we needed to unleash the full, purifying force of the law. The old ways were too slow. Even our revolutionary tribunal, as efficient as it was encumbered by lingering legal formalities. Witnesses, defense counsels, drawn-out hearings, these were luxuries we could no longer afford. They were loopholes through which the guilty might escape. We needed to strip the machine down to its essential components, to create a system of justice as swift and certain as the falling blade itself. This was to be the final sprint. The Great Terror was not an escalation for its own sake. It was an acceleration. The goal was to complete the work of the revolution, to purge the last of its enemies, and to finally usher in the republic of virtue that we had all bled for. It was a short, sharp, terrible storm, intended to clear the air forever. When you are so close to utopia, you cannot allow procedural delays to stand in your way. And so, on the 10th of June, 1794, or, as we called it, the 22nd Prairial in the year 2 of the Republic, we passed a new law, a law of sublime and terrifying simplicity. It was drafted by Couthon, with Robespierre's full support. It was a law designed to make justice as efficient as a slaughterhouse. It was the legal instrument that would unleash the Great Terror. Its first and most profound innovation was the abolition of the right to defense. The preliminary hearing was gone. The accused was no longer permitted a lawyer to speak for them. The logic was impeccable. If you were a true patriot, Your innocence would be self-evident and require no defense. If you were an enemy of the people, you deserved no defense. It simplified matters wonderfully. The rules of evidence were similarly refined. Tangible proof, written documents, eyewitness testimony. These things were often hard to come by. The law of 22nd Prairial did away with them. The court could now secure a conviction based on moral proof alone. The conscience of the jury, a gut feeling, a sense that the accused had the look of a traitor. This was now sufficient grounds to send a man or a woman to the guillotine. The role of witnesses was naturally curtailed. Why call witnesses when the guilt or innocence of the accused was a matter of moral intuition? They were to be called only if the court deemed it absolutely necessary for some reason, which it rarely did. A trial was now reduced to its bare essence: an accusation from the state, a brief identification of the prisoner, and a swift judgment. And what a judgment it was! The new law eliminated all lesser penalties. There would be no more imprisonment, no more deportation. There were now only two possible verdicts the tribunal could deliver: acquittal or death. You were either a pure, innocent patriot, free to go, or you were an enemy of the Republic, condemned to immediate extermination. There was no longer room for nuance. The law also cast the widest possible net, expanding the definition of an enemy of the people to a breathtaking degree. It now included anyone who sought to inspire discouragement, to deprave morals, to impair the energy and purity of revolutionary principles, or even to spread false news. In essence, if you were not actively and joyfully supporting us, you were a criminal, worthy of death. It was the ultimate test of loyalty. The effect was instantaneous. The Revolutionary Tribunal, now unshackled from the chains of legal procedure, began to work at a furious pace. The daily roll call for the guillotine became a torrent. The tumbrils that carried the condemned were constantly rumbling through the streets of Paris. The trickle of executions became a flood. To increase efficiency, we began to try prisoners in large groups, or batches. 30, 40, sometimes more than 50 people would be tried together, accused of participating in one single, often entirely fabricated, prison plot. Their names would be read aloud, they would be asked to stand for identification, and then a single verdict would condemn them all. It was an assembly line of justice. One of the most memorable of these batches involved the nuns of a Carmelite convent, executed along with dozens of others. Their supposed crime was fanaticism. Their real crime was their faith. As they were led to the scaffold one by one, they sang the Veni Creator Spiritus, their voices only silenced as the blade fell on each of them in turn. It was a moving display, we suppose, but ultimately futile against the logic of the state. The work was so relentless that it began to take a toll even on the machinery of death itself. The public executioner, Sanson, and his assistants were exhausted. The residents of the square where the guillotine stood began to complain vociferously about the stench of blood that hung permanently in the air. We had to move the entire operation to the eastern edge of Paris, to a less fashionable neighborhood, to continue our work without offending the delicate sensibilities of the citizenry. For 49 days, Paris lived in a state of suspended animation. The Great Terror silenced the city. People stayed in their homes, afraid to speak, afraid to even look at their neighbors with anything other than fervent patriotism. The lists of the executed, posted daily, grew longer and longer. It was the quiet of a city holding its breath, waiting for the fever to break. The numbers tell the story. In the 13 months before the law of 22nd Prairial, the Paris Revolutionary Tribunal had sentenced about 1,250 people to death. In the 49 days after the law was passed, it condemned more than 1,376. The rate of execution had increased more than tenfold. This was purification on industrial scale. But such a fire once unleashed.
The glorious work of revolution is not confined to the halls of government or the grand squares of Paris. For the Republic to live, the countryside must serve. But the farmer, the peasant, is a stubborn creature. We speak to them of virtue, of the supreme being, of the glorious destiny of the nation. They, in turn, speak to us of lame horses, of poor rainfall, of the price of salt. It is frustrating. The peasants complain of hunger, of lost sons sent to the frontiers. I tell them it is for the Republic, for liberty. They seem unconvinced. They are very focused on mundane things like bread and whether their roof leaks. One cannot build a perfect society on empty stomachs, we understand that, but one must try. And if trying requires a firm hand to guide the plough of progress, then so be it. Do not misunderstand. Paris is the heart and brain of the revolution, but the countryside is its stomach and its arms. The sans-culottes in the city cannot eat rhetoric, and our 14 armies cannot march on patriotic fervor alone. The entire grand project, from the debates in the Convention to the fall of the blade in the Place de la Révolution, is fueled by the grain and the muscle of rural France, a fact they sometimes seem to forget. We gave them what they always wanted. We abolished the tithe to the church, we burned the feudal charters and freed them from the heel of the aristocrat. We broke their ancient chains. By all rights, every farmer should have been a fervent, grateful revolutionary. Every village should have been a bastion of republican virtue. But gratitude, it seems, has a short memory. The problem is one of tradition. The peasant is a creature of habit. He is suspicious of new ideas, especially those that come from the city. He clung to his old god, his old calendar, his old ways. We saw a new dawn for humanity. He saw a group of lawyers from Paris telling him he could no longer celebrate the feast day of his village saint. He was, in many ways, an anchor holding back the ship of state. The central conflict was simple. We in Paris needed two things from the provinces: their sons for the army and their grain for our bread. The provinces, in their short-sightedness, were often reluctant to part with either. They saw a son taken from the fields as a lost harvest. They saw a requisitioned sack of wheat as a threat to their own survival. Our national vision clashed with their local anxieties. And so we were forced to act. Our policies were not designed to punish, but to educate, to unify, to make the farmer understand that his farm was not his own private property, but a national resource. His son was not merely his own flesh and blood, but a soldier of the Republic. It was a difficult lesson, and we were forced to be stern teachers. Take the levée en masse, our great national conscription. From Paris, it was a stirring call to arms, a nation rising as one. But what did it mean in a small village in the Dardong? It meant the strongest and healthiest young men, the backbone of the harvest, were marched away. It meant fields tended by old men and women,
a loss of manpower that could mean the difference between sustenance and starvation. Then there was the matter of food. To feed the cities and the armies, we sent out armed groups, the aptly named revolutionary armies, composed of zealous Parisian sans-culottes. Their task was simple: to go into the countryside and seize grain from any farmer suspected of hoarding. It was a direct, efficient way to provision the revolution. The farmers, for some reason, often saw it as armed robbery. To combat inflation, we instituted the law of the general maximum. We set a national price for essential goods: bread, meat, firewood, leather. This was a triumph of social justice, protecting the urban poor from price gouging. However, the official prices were often set so low that farmers would lose money to take their goods to market, a perplexing dilemma. Their response was predictable and profoundly selfish. They began to hide their grain. They slaughtered their own livestock for their families rather than sell it at a loss. They engaged in a silent, stubborn rebellion of non-compliance. What we in Paris called hoarding and counter-revolutionary speculation, they simply called feeding their children. This attitude could not be tolerated. The punishment for hoarding was made clear. The guillotine was not only a feature of the grand squares of Paris. Mobile guillotines were sent into the countryside, a stark reminder of republican justice. When a farmer was executed in his village square for the crime of hiding a few sacks of wheat, it served as a powerful lesson to his neighbors on the importance of national solidarity. Our campaign of de-Christianization also met a bewildering resistance. We sought to free them from superstition. We closed their crumbling old churches, melted down their useless bells to make cannons, and arrested priests who refused to swear allegiance to the state. We saw it as liberation. They saw it as an attack on the very soul of their community, an assault on 1,000 years of tradition. The new Republican calendar was another point of friction. It was a beautiful, rational system based on the decimal system and the natural seasons. What could be more logical? Yet the farmers, stubborn as ever, missed their saints' days and their 7-day week. They complained that our new day of rest every 10 days meant they had to work longer stretches. They simply could not appreciate the elegant symmetry of it all. To oversee these vital reforms, we sent out our representatives on mission. These were trusted deputies from the convention, vested with the full authority of the Republic. They had the power to levy taxes, raise troops, and set up revolutionary tribunals. They were the uncompromising hand of virtue, and they often wore a heavy glove. In some regions, this friction exploded into open warfare. The Vendée became the bleeding heart of the counter-revolution. Enraged by conscription and the attacks on their priests, a massive peasant army rose up, fighting for God and king. It was a brutal, savage civil war, a testament to the terrifying power of rural ignorance when properly mobilized. The suppression had to be absolute. We had no choice. We sent our best generals and our most ruthless policies. We created the infernal columns, military units whose sole purpose was to march through the Vendée and burn everything in their path: villages, farms, crops, people. It was a horrific necessity. The rebellion had to be excised from the body of the Republic, like a cancerous growth. In other regions, like Lyon and Marseille, the anger was more political, a federalist revolt against the centralization of power in Paris. But here, too, the dynamic was the same. The cities were hubs of resistance, supported by a countryside that resented Paris's endless demands. When we crushed these cities, we were also crushing the hopes of the surrounding provinces. The fate of Lyon was a particularly instructive example. Our representatives there, Collot d'Herbois and Joseph Fouché, found the guillotine too slow for the scale of the treason. They began executing prisoners in mass shootings, lining them up before open graves and mowing them down with cannon loaded with grape shot. They called this the mitraillade. It was horribly effective. Lyon was to be erased and renamed Liberated City. This level of brutality, while regrettable, was essential. The news spread. The lesson was learned. Defiance had a price, and that price was annihilation. For every village that rebelled, there were 100 that submitted in sullen silence. Fear proved to be far more effective tool for requisitioning grain than patriotic speeches. And so the countryside, for the most part, endured. They watched their sons march away. They handed over their grain to the revolutionary armies. They saw their churches closed and their traditions abolished. They lived in a state of quiet, pervasive fear, ruled by committees in nearby towns who could arrest them for a muttered complaint. They bore the weight of the revolution on their stooped shoulders. The great paradox is that the very heart of the terror in Paris was kept beating by the sacrifices of the countryside. The Sans-culottes, who demanded more executions, were kept from rioting by the subsidized bread we provided them, bread made from grain seized from farmers who were themselves going hungry. The urban revolution was fed by the unwilling rural population. In our speeches and pamphlets, the peasant was a simple figure. He was either the embodiment.
There is a profound and terrible irony at the heart of our great enterprise. We began with a shout for freedom. Now we whisper accusations in shadowed rooms. We started with a promise of fraternity, of a nation of brothers, arm in arm. Now we watch friends betray friends, and brothers send brothers to the scaffold. The revolution, she has a prodigious appetite, especially for her own children. A rather efficient form of population control, perhaps, when you think about it. Consider the word that started it all, liberty. In 1789, it was a soaring eagle, a promise of release from the cage of monarchy. By 1794, liberty meant the freedom to conform, the freedom to subordinate your individual will to the general will as defined by the committee, the freedom to do exactly as you were told for the good of the Republic. Any other form of liberty was deemed treasonous license. Remember the explosion of free speech? The thousands of pamphlets, the radical newspapers that blossomed in the early days, a glorious chaos of ideas. Now that garden has been ruthlessly pruned. A single errant article, a moment of misplaced wit, like that of our former friend Camille Deshumains, became a capital crime. The only truly free speech left was the freedom to applaud our decrees with sufficient enthusiasm. And what of equality, that noble dream of a nation without privilege, where all citizens stand equal before the law? We achieved it, in a way. The guillotine is the great equalizer. The blade makes no distinction between the neck of a duke and the neck of a baker. In the face of the national razor, all men are truly and finally equal. It is the most profound equality of all, the equality of the grave. Our laws perfected this grim democracy. The law of suspects made every citizen equally vulnerable to denunciation. The law of 22 Prairial made each citizen equally defenseless before the revolutionary tribunal.
We had created a perfect equality of fear. No one was above suspicion. No one was safe. In this, at least, we were remarkably consistent. All were equal in their potential to be declared an enemy of the people. But it is the ideal of fraternity that suffered the most spectacular decay. The promise of national brotherhood, of civic love. This was twisted into its opposite, a patriotic duty to spy on your brother, to listen at his door, to read his letters, to report his moment of weakness or his flicker of doubt. The good citizen was not his brother's keeper, but his brother's informer. The family of the Republic was a family of secret police. There is a terrible driving logic to this process. The more perfect our vision of the Republic became, the more flawed its actual citizens appeared in comparison. To build a republic of virtue, you must first clear away all those who are not perfectly virtuous. But the standard for virtue is constantly rising. The bar is raised, and those who cannot clear it must be eliminated. This is why yesterday's hero inevitably becomes today's traitor. The constitutional monarchists of 1789 were patriots until the true republicans surpassed them. The Girondins were patriots until the Mountain proved more revolutionary. Danton was a patriot until he tired of the struggle. The revolution is a race, and those who fall behind are not merely lapped, they are trampled. The cycle of purges became self-sustaining. It was fueled by fear and ambition. To prove your own revolutionary bona fides, you had to be more zealous, more demanding, more ruthless than your colleagues. And the easiest way to demonstrate your purity was to denounce someone else for their lack of it. It was a deadly contest to see who could be the most uncompromising, the most incorruptible. Friendship, which should be a private virtue, became a public liability. The bond between Robespierre and Desumais, once a mark of their shared journey, became a weakness. To prove his absolute dedication to the Republic over any personal feeling, he had to be willing to sacrifice his friend. It was the ultimate test of his incorruptibility, a terrible demonstration that his only loyalty was to the abstract ideal of the state. The personal was obliterated by the political. Family ties, old allegiances, shared memories, all were rendered meaningless before the judgment of the committee. We demanded that citizens see themselves not as husbands, fathers, or friends, but only as citizens. And a citizen's first and only duty is to the Republic. Any other loyalty was a form of treason. Even our language began to consume itself. Words like liberty, virtue, and patriot were invoked to justify every arrest, every execution, every new restriction on freedom. They were repeated endlessly from the tribune, hammered into the public consciousness until they became less like ideas and more like liturgical chants, signals of conformity, rather than expressions of belief. This was the purpose of the fear. It was a dissolvent. It was designed to dissolve all the old bonds that held society together, the bonds of family, of community, of private friendship. When all these connections were broken, All that remained was the solitary individual, standing alone and naked before the all-powerful, all-seeing state. And from our perspective, this was not decay. It was creation. To build a new world, the old one must be utterly annihilated. We were not destroying society. We were melting it down. We were breaking it apart into its constituent atoms so that we could forge it anew, in a purer, stronger, more virtuous form. The process was agonizing, but the goal was sublime. Think of the roll call of those the revolution has consumed. It began with the obvious enemies, the king and queen, a necessary symbolic amputation. Their removal was the price of entry into the new world. They were the first course in a long and bloody banquet. Then came the architects of the early revolution, the eloquent Girondins, men like Brissot and Vergniaud. They believed the revolution should end with the establishment of a respectable, lawful republic. They failed to understand that a revolution is not an event, but a process with an insatiable hunger. Then the revolution turned left and devoured the ultra-radicals, Hébert and his followers, the street-corner atheists who thought they could steer the terror. They learned that the revolution does not tolerate rivals, only servants. It consumes from all sides, seeking always the disciplined, virtuous center that we represented. And then, most spectacularly, it turned on its own titans. Danton, the thundering voice of defiance. Deshumain, the brilliant pen of liberty. They thought their fame and their past service made them invulnerable. A fatal error. In the eyes of the revolution, past glories are no defense against present impurities. Even those who stood apart from politics were not safe. The great chemist Lavoisier, who discovered oxygen, was told, "The Republic has no need of scientists," before he was sent to the guillotine. The mathematician Condorcet, a champion of human rights,
In a time of revolution, traditional justice is an unaffordable luxury. It is a tangled web of procedures, appeals, and technicalities designed to protect the individual. But our goal was not to protect the individual, it was to save the nation. For this, a new kind of justice was required, a justice that was swift, certain, and served as a weapon. Innocence? A bourgeois concept. Virtue is all. And if your virtue does not align with the committee's current decree, well then you are clearly an enemy of the people. A rather simple system, very streamlined, and very final. The Revolutionary Tribunal was not established to be a court of law in the old sense. Its purpose was not to weigh evidence or ponder legal philosophy. Its purpose was to be a political instrument, an engine for the elimination of the Republic's enemies. It was the judicial arm of the terror, and its function was to ratify the decisions made by the Committees of Public Safety and General Security. To ask if it was fair is to ask the wrong question. One should ask if it was effective, and it was, magnificently so. The very idea of innocence had to be re-evaluated. Innocence implies a crime has been committed and the accused did not do it. But the crime we were prosecuting was more subtle. It was the crime of being an enemy of liberty, a crime of the soul. How does one prove they are not a secret royalist? How does one defend against the charge of insufficient enthusiasm? These are not legal questions, they are political ones. The tribunal was there to provide political answers.
At the head of this enterprise was the public prosecutor, Antoine Quentin Fouquier Tinville, a man of prodigious energy and unwavering purpose. He saw himself not as a lawyer, but as a public servant tasked with a vital, if unpleasant, duty. He was the great purveyor to the guillotine. He processed cases with the detached efficiency of a factory foreman, unburdened by the sentimental baggage of doubt or mercy. He kept the machine well-oiled and running on schedule. The courtroom itself, in the old Palace of Justice, was a theater designed for conviction. The judges, their faces grim, sat elevated above the proceedings. The jury, good patriots all, were selected by the Jacobin Club. The accused were packed into the dock, often in large groups, facing their judges but unable to see the witnesses or the public in the gallery. It was a stage set for a tragedy where the final act was already written. The fundamental principle guiding the tribunal was that of predetermination. An accusation by a revolutionary committee was in itself strong evidence of guilt. Why would good patriots accuse a fellow citizen without cause? Therefore, the trial was not an investigation to discover the truth. It was a public ritual to confirm a decision that had already been made in the closed-door sessions of the committees. The trial was the ceremony, not the verdict. The process began with an accusation that was often breathtakingly vague. A citizen could be arrested and charged simply with being an enemy of the people or conspiring against the unity of the Republic. There was no need for specific details of time or place. The accusation was against your character, not your actions. This was a tremendous advantage, as character is so much more difficult to defend than an alibi. In the early days of the Terror, the accused was technically allowed a defense lawyer. But this was a cruel joke. What was a lawyer to do? If he mounted a vigorous defense of his client, he drew suspicion upon himself. He could be accused of being an accomplice, of showing sympathy for a traitor. Defending a suspect before the revolutionary tribunal quickly became one of the most hazardous professions in France. Then, with the law of 22 Prairial, we corrected this flaw. The right to a defense counsel was abolished entirely. A magnificent simplification. It did away with the tedious and time-wasting spectacle of lawyers attempting to muddy the waters with legal arguments. The truth, we argued, needed no advocate, and treason deserved none. The path from accusation to judgment was now beautifully direct. The question of evidence was handled with similar efficiency. The need for material proof, letters, documents, weapons, was deemed unnecessary. These things could be forged or misinterpreted. Instead, the tribunal was empowered to act on moral proof. This meant that the sincere belief of the jury in the prisoner's guilt was sufficient for a conviction. It was a more spiritual form of justice, based on patriotic intuition rather than mundane facts. The questioning of the accused became the centerpiece of the trial. It was not a cross-examination, but a political and moral interrogation. The president of the tribunal would pepper the prisoner with questions. Did you rejoice at the execution of the tyrant Capet? Why were you not at the festival of the Supreme Being? Can you name the patriots on your local committee? A moment of hesitation, a nervous glance, the wrong tone of voice, all could be interpreted as moral proof of guilt. The jury, of course, was the key. They were not a random selection of citizens. They were salaried officials, dedicated Jacobins, whose loyalty was beyond question. Their role was not to be impartial arbiters of fact. Their role was to represent the conscience of the revolution. They were there to sniff out the impure, to identify the enemies of virtue, and to confirm the judgment of the prosecutor. This system reached its logical peak with the batch trials. To save time, dozens of prisoners would be tried at once. They would be accused of a single, overarching conspiracy, usually a fantastical prison plot to overthrow the government from within their cells. Most of them had never even spoken to one another. Their names would be read out, a few would be briefly questioned, and then a single verdict would condemn the entire group. It was justice by wholesale. The delivery of the verdict was a moment of stark, minimalist theater. There were no long deliberations. The jury would confer for a few minutes, and the foreman would return. The president would ask, "Is the accused guilty?" The foreman would respond with a simple yes or no. Then the sentence would be read. For the guilty, there was only one: death. The entire process for a batch of 50 people could take less than an hour. In this system, mercy was not merely absent, it was considered a crime in itself. To plead for mercy for a condemned prisoner meant to show solidarity with a traitor. It meant you too were soft, indulgent, and potentially an enemy of the people. This was the trap that had snared Danton. Our republic was being built on a foundation of stern, inflexible justice. Mercy was a crack in that foundation. There was no court of appeal. The verdict of the Revolutionary Tribunal was absolute and final. The condemned were immediately taken from the courtroom to the conciergerie prison, the antechamber of the guillotine. There, their hair would be cut, their collars torn open, and they would await the next morning's tumbril to make their final journey. Consider the case of the 16 Carmelite nuns from Compiègne. Their crime? Fanaticism and conspiring against the Republic. Their trial was a formality. Their true offense was their unwavering loyalty to a power other than the state. Their innocence in any real sense was completely irrelevant. They represented an alternative ideology, and for that they had to be silenced. Of course, some people were acquitted. Especially in the early days, a verdict of not guilty was possible. But this offered only temporary relief. An acquittal did not grant immunity. The accused person could be arrested again just days later on a new, equally vague charge. The system was designed to be relentless. If it did not get you today, it might get you tomorrow. Imagine the psychological state of the accused. To stand in that dock knowing that nothing you say will make any difference. Knowing that your life story, your intentions, your character, your innocence are all utterly irrelevant. Knowing that you are not a person, but a case to be processed, a name on a list to be checked off. The system was designed to crush a person's spirit long before the blade crushed their vertebrae. This was entirely the point. The silence of the innocent is the loudest sound from the Reign of Terror. It is the echo that remains after the speeches have faded and the blade has rusted. It is the sound of a revolution that, in its quest for a perfect world, abolished not only mercy, but reason itself. To truly understand the verdict of history.
The whispers. They grow louder now. In the corridors of the convention, in the committee rooms where we once decided the fate of France as one. I see it in their eyes, even among my closest allies, my colleagues. They look at me with fear and perhaps a hint of plotting. Turns out, once you had perfected the art of purging, everyone becomes quite adept at it. A rather ironic twist, wouldn't you say? The revolution, as they say, devours its children, and I, it seems, am quite plump. It is the month of Thermidor, the month of heat, in the year 2 of our republic. The Great Terror is at its zenith, the blade falling with the steady rhythm of a clock. Our armies are victorious on every front.
The threat of foreign invasion, the great justification for our stern measures, has been vanquished. And yet the terror continues, even accelerates. Why? Because the enemy is not at the borders anymore. The enemy is here, in this room, all around me. The Committee of Public Safety, once a brotherhood of iron will, is now a nest of vipers. Below de Varennes, Collot d'Elbois, Carnot, these men who once signed the death warrants with me now greet me with a chilling formality. They resent my influence. They call my pursuit of virtue tyranny. They are compromised, corrupt, tired. They no longer have the stomach for what must be done, and they hate me for reminding them of it. For weeks I have withdrawn from their presence. I cannot bear to sit at a table with men I know are conspiring against the Republic, against me. They say I am isolating myself, that I am plotting. The fools! I am not plotting. I am mourning. I am mourning the death of virtue in the very heart of our government. My absence is not a conspiracy, it is a judgment. My only solace is the Jacobin Club. There, among the true, unwavering patriots, I can still speak freely. There they understand that the revolution is not over just because an army has won a battle. They understand that the war against corruption, against weakness, against vice is eternal. I speak to them of the traitors in our midst, and they roar their approval. They are my last bastion of purity in a city sinking into compromise. But my paranoia has become a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more I speak of hidden enemies and secret lists of traitors, the more my colleagues are driven to conspire. They huddle in corners, their fear forging them into a single block of opposition. My accusations, meant to purify the government, are instead uniting it against me. A perfect, deadly paradox. I have taught them to fear, and now they use that lesson to plot my destruction. On the 8th of Thermidor, I decide I can be silent no longer. I will return to the National Convention and confront them all. I will lay bare the conspiracy. I will appeal to the deputies, to their latent virtue. I still believe in the power of truth, in the resonance of a single incorruptible voice against a chorus of lies. I will deliver a speech that will save the Republic, or I will perish with it. For 2 hours I speak from the tribune. I speak of my tireless work, of the burdens I have carried, of the slanders against my name. I speak of the vast conspiracy that seeks to undo our great work, a coalition of corrupt men who wish to halt the terror so their own crimes will not be punished. And then I make my move. I tell them I have a new list of traitors, a list of deputies who must be purged. And then my fatal error. I do not name them. I hold the list over their heads like a sword, believing the threat alone will be enough to shatter their conspiracy and bring them to heel. I believe they will be paralyzed by fear. I am wrong. By not naming the names, I have made every man in that hall a suspect in his own mind. The moderates, the corrupt, the rival terrorists, all believe their name might be on my list. I have not divided them. I have given them a single, unifying cause, their own survival. I have turned a room of disparate factions into a single gang, united by their mortal terror of me. The speech is met with a stunned, hostile silence. The usual applause is thin, uncertain. Then the questions begin. Cambon, a man of finance, rises.
Before I am dishonored, I will speak to France, he declares. Below de Varenne demands that I name the accused. I refuse. The spell of my authority, for the first time, is broken. I leave the hall, defeated. That night, at the Jacobin Club, they cheer the same speech, but it is a hollow victory. The real battle was already lost. The next day, the 9th of Thermidor, is the day the trap is sprung. My young ally, the angel of death, Saint Just, takes the tribune to deliver a report. He barely begins before he is shouted down. Tallien, a man I had recalled from Bordeaux for his corruption, brandishes a dagger and denounces me as a new Cromwell. The hall erupts in a coordinated roar, "Down with the tyrant!" I rush to the tribune to defend myself, to speak, but my voice is drowned out. The president of the convention, my supposed colleague Collot d'Herbois, rings his bell incessantly, refusing to allow me the floor. The great orator of the revolution, the man whose words had shaped the course of history, is rendered mute. I am a king without a voice, a prophet without a tongue. My throat is raw with fury and desperation. I turn to the deputies on the plain, the moderates I had so long despised, and beg them to hear me. They turn away. It is then that a deputy, Garnier de l'Aube, screams the words that will seal my fate. "The blood of Danton chokes you." In that moment, the ghosts of all those I had purged fill the room, their silent accusations joining the chorus of the living. The convention, in a flurry of fear and adrenaline, votes for my arrest. And not just me. My devoted younger brother, Augustine, who leapt to my defense, the paralytic Couthon in his wheelchair, the beautiful, implacable Saint Just, my closest allies. We, the architects of the terror, are now declared its enemies. We are to be handed over to the justice we ourselves created. For a few hours there is chaos and a flicker of hope. The wardens of the prisons of Paris, still loyal to the Commune and to me, refuse to accept us as prisoners. We are freed and gather at the Hôtel de Ville, the city hall. We try to rally the sections of Paris to call upon the National Guard to defend us against the traitorous convention. But the call is weak. The people are tired. Tired of the blood, tired of the virtue, tired of me. The convention acts with a speed and ruthlessness that I taught them. They declare me and my followers outlaws. This is the final checkmate. As outlaws, we can be executed within 24 hours without trial on simple identification. They have used my own weapons against me. The forces loyal to the convention muster and prepare to storm our last refuge. The end is a scene of bloody, pathetic chaos. As the soldiers of the convention burst into the Hôtel de Ville, my friend Lebas shoots himself in the head. My brother, Augustine, in despair, throws himself from a window, shattering his leg on the stones below. Couthon is found hiding under a table. And I am discovered on the floor, my jaw shattered by a pistol shot. Whether my own hand or another's, no one can say for sure. The final hours are a living nightmare of humiliation. They lay me, the Incorruptible, on a table in the very room where the Committee of Public Safety held its sessions. My jaw is a mess of blood and shattered bone, crudely bandaged with a piece of cloth. For hours I lie there, silent and bleeding, as my former colleagues, my creatures, file past to stare, to mock, to gloat at the fallen tyrant. On the 10th of Thermidor, there is no trial, there is no defense.
The static grows louder now, a sound like a million angry whispers. In the distance, the indistinct roar of a crowd, a beast with no head and 1,000 mouths. They are calling for my head, the fools, the very head that labored day and night to conceive of a republic worthy of them, a republic of virtue. It seems they would prefer a republic of wine, women, and comfortable corruption. So be it. The transmission, it seems, is coming to an end. We began this journey in 1789 with a promise: liberty, equality, fraternity. The words were like fireworks, illuminating a sky that had been dark for 1,000 years. We stormed the Bastille, we broke the chains, we tore down a king. We dreamt of a new Sparta, a new Rome, a nation of virtuous citizens guided by reason and a love for the fatherland. A beautiful, glorious, and perhaps impossible dream. For a dream to become reality, one must be a stern architect. One must clear the ground of all the old rotten foundations. The aristocracy, the priesthood, the monarchy, all the rubble of the old world had to be swept away. And then we discovered the rot was not just in the institutions, but in the hearts of men. Greed, selfishness, nostalgia for tyranny. The purification had to go deeper. This is what the sentimentalists who now condemn me will never understand. The terror was not an act of rage. It was an act of profound, if terrible, love. It was the love of a physician for his patient. The Republic was sick, dying from the twin diseases of foreign invasion and internal conspiracy. The guillotine was not an instrument of vengeance. It was a surgical tool. We were cutting away the cancer so that the nation might live. It was bloody, yes, but surgery always is. We had to redefine justice for an age of revolution. The old concepts of innocence and guilt were legal fictions, bourgeois luxuries that allowed traitors to hide behind procedure. We replaced them with a single higher standard: virtue. Were you for the Republic, body and soul, or were you against it? There was no third option. The Revolutionary Tribunal was not a court of law. It was a crucible designed to test the purity of each citizen's soul. The hardest cuts were the closest. Danton, who once was the roaring heart of the revolution, grew fat with corruption and soft with indulgence. Camille, whose pen once sparked our flame, tried to use it to extinguish the fire. To spare them would have been a betrayal of everything we stood for. It would have meant that friendship was more important than the fatherland, that personal affection mattered more than public virtue. To prove the revolution was incorruptible, I had to prove that I was, even if it meant sacrificing my own friends. Did we go too far? A foolish question. Our only mistake was in not going far enough. Our only error was in hesitating to purge the final nest of vipers who now bring me down. The Talliens, the Fouchés, the Barras, these are not men of virtue. They are creatures of opportunity, terrorists of fear, who now posture as men of mercy to save their own worthless necks. They will build a republic of bankers and deal-makers on my grave, a republic of compromise, a republic of filth. And so, as the sun sets on another day of what was once necessary purification, and perhaps on my own brief sojourn among the living,
This has been Maximilien Robespierre, your humble and eternally incorruptible broadcaster from the height of the terror. We sought virtue, demanded purity, and paid the ultimate price. My only regret is that I will not be there to see the new dawn I made possible. If this desperate, darkly humorous transmission from the very heart of revolutionary fervor has given you a moment of profound contemplation, or perhaps made you appreciate your own era's relative lack of public executions for lack of enthusiasm, then my purpose is served. Keep listening, keep questioning, and for the sake of the Republic, however it may choose to define itself, keep that subscribe button pressed. Because even when the blade falls, the principles, however bloody, endure. Until the next broadcast from a very different Republic. Vive la Revolution!